G'day. Worst case scenario, excuse or enabler? The worst case scenario almost never happens. Now, I know that seems a bit silly to say right now, given the global pandemic that we're living through, but I would argue that a big part of the reason why we're in such a mess is because of exactly that. This worst case scenario almost never happens. And so we don't have the systems and processes and knowledge and experiences in place to be able to cope with it. And the reason I think this is an important message is because I realized this morning as I was contemplating whether or not to go on my morning walk, as I looked outside, it's dark, it's rainy, it's wet, it's slippery. I was looking to use the worst case scenario as an enabler, as a motivator, but I could have very easily been using it as an excuse. What's the worst that can happen? I head off on my walk, the path is slippery, I slip over, I roll an ankle, I pull a groin muscle, I slip over, crack my head open and die. That's the extreme worst case scenario. But that almost never happens, let's be honest. And so what I do is I use the worst case scenario test as an enabler. I say to myself, the worst that can happen is this. Even if I was to crack my head and die, that's the extreme worst case. It almost never happens. It just doesn't. History has shown me that the worst case scenario almost never happens. It never becomes an eventuality. And pretty much every big decision I've ever made in my life, as I spoke to you about back in episode 246 of this show, I've applied this worst case scenario test. And I realized this morning that I use it as an enabler, as a motivator. But it's a fine line between using that worst case scenario test as an excuse. If you want to find an excuse, the worst case scenario test will give you that. But if you want to use it as an enabler, it can be very powerful. Whether it was changing jobs, switching careers, moving to a new country, I always ask myself, what's the worst case scenario? And even if the extreme happened, I could still live with it. But the reality is the extreme almost never happens. The worst case scenario almost never plays out. So what I'd like to know is, do you apply this worst case scenario thinking or test or criteria to your big decisions? And if you do you use it as an excuse or as an enabler? Let me know what you think. Alrighty, that is it for today. I do thank you for your time, and I will be back again tomorrow. See ya.